Welcome, brothers and sisters, again to another segment of Moments with the Master. My name is Brother Ripken Pickney, and I'm one of the ministers and deacons here at Trinity Church of Christ. And I know what I want to talk to you about today is how we as Christians should know where our strength comes from. How we as Christians should know where our strength comes from. And the text we're going to look at to help emphasize this point is in Isaiah chapter 40, verses 25 through 31. Isaiah chapter 40, verses 25 through 31. And with all that's going on today, it's important to know where your strength comes from, because sometimes we get tired and we get weary and we get discouraged. So it's very beneficial for us as Christians to know where our strength comes from. But in Isaiah chapter 40, verses 25 through 31, Isaiah talks about how God has no equal, how it's nobody who you can compare God to, and how God has the power to sustain the stars in the sky, and how he even knows the name of every star in the sky, and how God has a limitless power source, and how God, because he has a limitless power source, that he is able to strengthen the weary and give power to the weak. And he also talks about how young people, how they sometimes grow tired and weary, but those that place their hope in the Lord, they will renew their strength. They will mount up on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and faint not. So Isaiah helps us to understand this within this text. There's a few things that we can take from this text. Number one is that we serve a God who has a limitless power supply. God's power is everlasting. It's everlasting. That means it does not run out. And the reason why that is good for us is because if we are connected to God who has a limitless power supply, that means we have a limitless or an everlasting power supply, a power supply that won't run out. If you think about it, every power supply you have within your life, or battery and whatnot you may have, that battery will eventually lose its power. Whether we're talking about your cell phone battery, whether we're talking about your car battery. Even though I know these batteries can be recharged, but eventually they will get to the point where they will not be able to hold their charge. But we serve a God who power will not run out. Number one, it doesn't need to be recharged. His power doesn't need to be recharged because his power never runs out. And that's good to know that when we're feeling tired and weak and when we feel like we want to give up, because sometimes when you are going through the day-to-day activities of life, when you are trying to address all the responsibilities you have, the responsibilities at work and at home, and just trying to serve God, sometimes you can feel tired and just worn out and feel as if you just don't have any more energy to give. But when you think about it, when you realize you are connected to God who has a limitless power supply, you realize that if I place my hope in him, I can renew my strength. So that's the first thing that we can learn from this text, is that we serve a God who has a limitless power supply. The second thing we can learn from this text is that in order to be connected to that power supply, we have to place our hope in God. We have to place our hope in God if we want to be connected to the power supply. So often we place our hope in everything else. We place our hope in people and in our jobs, how we look, how much we may know, our finances. And eventually these things can and they will fail us. And when they do fail us, we feel discouraged, we feel broken down, we feel despair because we placed our hope in the wrong things. And before we know it, we turn into worldly sources to try to refill our energy, when all along, all we had to do was place our hope in the Lord. Now somebody may ask, well, how do you place your hope in the Lord? How do you get connected to that power supply? You place your hope in the Lord by diving deep into his word. Because when you dive deep into his word helps to not only physically rejuvenate you, but it spiritually rejuvenates you. When you start to read his word and you read scriptures such as Philippians 4 and 13, when Paul talks about how he can do all things through Christ Jesus who strengthens him. When you read scriptures like Romans 8 and 31, which tells us that if God is for us, who can be against us? When you read scriptures like Romans 8 and 37, when Paul talks about how we are more than conquerors, it helps to spiritually and physically rejuvenate you and help you to realize that you can make it, and that as long as you trust in God, you will not grow tired or too weary to the point where the world will overcome you. So I just want to encourage you today to remember where your strength comes from, because again, through the day-to-day activities, we can feel worn out. We can feel like we just don't have enough to give out anymore. But when we place our hope in the Lord, He gives us that extra energy, or that second wind, athletes like to call it, that we need. But again, we must remember that in order to be connected to that power supply, we got to place our hope in the Lord. Thanks again for joining us for another segment of Moments with the Master. Until next time, may God bless you and keep you.